So, Alex, last time that we spoke, we ended on a dire note, which is most people in Pemex are very hardworking. They're trying really hard. Um, the state seemed to have abandoned the company, just let it sort of fall apart, and it didn't seem that there was really anything to do.
And that's more or less how most people feel right now. Just before we dive into why we got to this moment in time, at the moment, the main conversation going on in Mexico surrounding investment, stability, is actually all focused around Pemex. Pemex, as we said, is the most indebted oil company on earth. It is incredibly inefficient. It has declining output. It is the biggest handicap the Mexican government currently has. And yet, it is virtually untouchable. And I think that's what we're going to get up to in this particular episode, which is you've shown us the history and operational side of Pemex. Yet you can't answer the question as to why it's not working without going into the politics. I think a lot of people love to say, oh, it's just because politicians or the union or the administrators or the private sector are just corrupt, inept, or stupid. And that might be true some of the time. I'm not putting my hands into the fire for any of those. But that doesn't mean that everyone's like that. And as you said, right, you met a bunch of really great people stuck in a structural quagmire. So let's rewind a little bit, not as far as 1938, which is when Pemex was created, out of all the different private and foreign oil companies that ran Mexican oil back then. We're going to go to when it starts going really badly wrong, which is at the beginning of the 21st century, where Pemex's falling oil production and its increasing debt put Mexico on a path to disaster. Why is that? Because ultimately, Pemex is part of the Mexican state. And so different people approach it in different ways. At the time, we had center-right, we'll call them neoliberal governments, which was the parlance at the time, but it also reflects what people wanted to do with oil at the time. Even though it was a third rail, there was a lot of talk amongst politicians, especially in the PRI and the PAN, which were the ruling parties from the year 2000 until the year 2018, saying, all right, fine, we won't privatize Pemex in the same way we did with the telephone companies and a bunch of other companies because it's so valuable to Mexicans' identity. The oil is yours. Oil belongs to all Mexicans is the phrase, even though at this point it actually felt like the debt was Mexicans rather than the oil. And so the governments back then said, right, we're not going to privatize Pemex per se, but what we're going to do is we're going to open it up for investment. And we're going to split it up into different companies, and they're going to be profit-making companies. And so it's going to be a state-owned company, but run as a business. And the culmination of this logic happened during the government of Enrique Peña Nieto from 2012 to 2018. It was one of the biggest reforms of his government, and it was basically done with agreement with the PAN. It was a big alliance called the Pact for Mexico. It included a left-wing party, the PRD, but it left in horror because the PRD was, by that point, the party that felt it was the inheritor to Cárdenas's legacy. This is Lázaro Cárdenas, the president of Mexico who expropriated petrol in 1938, and who was the father of the founder of the PRD, many times presidential candidate, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. The PRD leaves in disgust. And yet, by the mere fact that they'd been in the Pact for Mexico, they ruined their reputation. I can't overstate how much this one party, which was the traditional left-wing party, undermined itself completely simply by being within striking distance of this oil reform. We'll come to what happens later to the PRD, but let's focus right now on that reform. So, the energy reform under Peña Nieto is really important because what it does is it opens up tranches of exploration and distribution of petrol all around Mexico. It was visible mostly, even though it's not the most profitable part of Pemex, but it was visible mostly because before that reform, the only petrol stations you saw around Mexico were that green and red logo, the Pemex logo. And then suddenly you started seeing BP, you started seeing Mexican companies spread all across Mexico, right? But really, what people were most excited about was exploration, especially deep water exploration, because, as Tavo said in the previous episode, the great crown jewel of Mexican oil, Cantarell, had been overexploited and mismanaged to the extent that it was basically beyond help. And so the theory was, if we parcel out Mexico's deep water exploration, we'll most likely find oil, especially given the fact that on the other side of the territorial waterline, the Americans are extracting loads of it. So let's just get private companies with the capital and the technology to get going on that.
And this actually made sense because when it comes to oil exploration, you have sort of your traditional, your conventional exploration, which tends to be on solid ground or in shallow water. The name speaks for itself. But then you have more complicated stuff, which is deep water. You're quite far away from the coast. You're in very, very deep water. That obviously leaves you exposed to the elements, but also you need very substantial and different engineering than you would in shallow water to be able to work in a stable and safe manner in the middle of the ocean. Furthermore, you have unconventionals, things like shale. So the conventional ones are like sort of underground pools of oil. You just stick a straw in. No Country for Old Men reference there.
I know, yes. Yeah, you drink his milkshake.
Exactly. And you stick your little straw in the milkshake and you just soak it up. You might lose pressure and then you inject nitrogen into the milkshake, but pretty standard. Unconventionals appear when you have a bunch of oil, but it's not in a nice pool. You might have like a millefeuille, let's say, where you have a little bit of oil and then a layer of rock and then a little bit of oil, then a layer of rock and so on. And you have other more complicated versions of it. The important thing here is Pemex, having not invested much money into developing additional capabilities, having not really invested in innovation at all for a very long time, was good enough at shallow water exploration. But it wasn't even realistic that they could try to carry out deep water unconventional exploration. So it made sense to reach out to the likes of BP, to the likes of Petrobras, who have this expertise and have them help you.
Of course, that was the argument behind the reform, and indeed, on paper, and in the years after the reform was approved, you could say that milkshake did bring all the boys to the yard. And yet...
You went there.
I did, yeah. And yet, the interests that needed to be addressed throughout this whole process stymied the entire operation. Corruption was a massive issue, in the same way that a massive flow of capital, because oil was discovered in the 1970s, corrupted the Mexican state into depending completely on oil incomes without being productive at all. It made the union one of the most powerful and yet most corrupt in Mexico. In the same way you got that bonanza during the 1970s and 80s that ended up being that monkey's paw curse. By the time the reform was approved, you had a different sort of curse. You had the promise of an oil bonanza without even the discovery of an equivalent of Cantarell. And so we've got all these different scams and cases of corruption that came out because so much money was being spread across the board. One of the biggest issues, of course, was Pemex functionaries overcharging for certain services. You had issues where the union was just being completely intransigent, and so the government had to play ball with them. And to be honest, the government at the time, under Peña Nieto, was the PRI's government, a PRI being the government that was inherited from the 20th century and which had a very close relationship with unions. They often used unions to control people and workers, but also as voting blocs. In fact, when the reform was passed, the oil union boss, Carlos Romero de Champs, was a PRI senator who full-throatedly supported the reform, even though most of his union hated it. In fact, he was the inheritor of the Pemex union from a guy called Laquina, and this is just a little tangent, but it just shows you how important and how convoluted the interests are around oil. Back in 1988, right in the dawn of the neoliberal economic age, where Mexico's already been hit by these terrible debt crises born of oil, the man who ran the oil union was called Laquina. I'm going to call him Laquina just to not flood you with names. And he got he was a very powerful man and got into a very big fight with the Mexican president.
Arguably, he was untouchable. That was sort of what everyone believed.
He was so untouchable that when the government did move against him because they were convinced that they were going to liberalize the economy, they didn't manage, by the way, with oil, but they were convinced they were going to try to do it. The regime did something they had only done twice before, which was send in the army, first during the Tlatelolco massacre in 1968, then during the so-called Halconazo, where they again repressed students in 1971, and then finally to arrest Laquina, to bring him to justice, because, of course, he was a very corrupt man. There's a lot on him. And he was chucked into jail and replaced with Carlos Romero de Champs, who was equally or perhaps more corrupt than Laquina, but crucially, he was in line with the government. And so these folks have to be negotiated with, along with the private sector, along with the people, and along with the nationalistic impulse that many Mexicans have and many other parties have to push against the privatization of what is seen as a national treasure. And you can sort of see how it works, right? Mexico was rich because of oil, and yet it was corrupt politicians who stole it all. And if only we had a good government who came in and didn't steal as much, then finally we can be rich and administer abundance, because good government is the only thing that we need to benefit from oil. That's the only reason Pemex is in the state it is. And so in 2018, we get the inheritor of the PRD, which collapsed after it was within striking distance, even though it was against it, of the energy reform. And that was Morena under Andrés Manuel López Obrador.
And he had a good story. This is not to defend AMLO or to attack AMLO, but just looking at the story that he told, even when you read the stuff by former CEOs of Pemex, yes, if there had been a different approach to managing Pemex by the government, if they had been less corrupt, if they had looked to the future and not just the short term, if they had invested in innovation and exploration correctly, then yes, Pemex would be in a very different place today. So when oil is so important to Mexican identity, let's say, and we know this to be true, or at least it is said to be true, then the story that AMLO's selling gets a lot of buyers.
Yet, AMLO had a great get-out-of-jail-free card, which is, oh my God, Pemex is in a lot of debt by the time he comes in. And so he needs to start doing things his way, but in a way where he gets away with a lot of the missteps that he did. One of the things that he tried to do, but he couldn't, was to roll back on the energy reforms. He couldn't do it because he didn't have a majority back then in Congress. And so he starts doing different things, taking on Pemex as it existed, but with a different understanding of what it was for. You've got to understand that Pemex, to Morena and to López Obrador and everyone who follows him, is not a profit-making endeavor. It's a social and political enterprise. It is not only a symbol of Mexico, it is also what should and can drive development for the poorest Mexicans. Companies must generate value for shareholders, but AMLO saw Pemex as the linchpin to Mexican sovereignty and prosperity. Now, let's take those two in order. I think they're really important. So sovereignty is a weird one, because to push sovereignty, which is we need to stop importing petrol, because by this point, Pemex was producing such low-quality oil and refining so little of it that it literally had to import petrol from foreign countries as an oil-producing nation.
So in 2015, for the first time in its history, Mexico goes from being, this titan of oil production of the oil world to, for the first time ever, being a net importer of hydrocarbons. And that hasn't stopped since.
And so AMLO goes about fixing this, because in the same way that his nationalism sees self-sufficiency as the main aim for a country, Pemex being the most important part of sovereignty becomes a crucial point to his administration. So he buys an oil refinery in Texas, which I think is fascinating, to import oil into Mexico, sure, from Texas, but owned by Pemex, the Mexican company. It's almost like an embassy for Pemex abroad. But then he does an even bigger thing, a massive investment in a titanic refinery in his home state of Tabasco. It's called Dos Bocas, and it is one of the most contentious projects of his administration. Enormously over budget, incredibly wasteful, and annoyingly, narratively quite a strong argument in the age we live in. So As AMLO built this refinery, the argument was, guys, come on, the world is moving away from fossil fuels, and this globalized economy is producing more than enough oil for Mexico to just move on, right? Just be more efficient at doing what you do, get out of debt, don't build some anachronistic oil refinery. And AMLO says no, because it's about sovereignty. And more or less at that time, two different things happen over the course of various years, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine leads to a blockade, basically, in the middle of the winter of natural gas going into Western Europe and Central Europe, which was a disaster because it caused enormous strife in Europe, but it also proved AMLO's point, which is, look at what Russia could do by flipping a switch. Couldn't that happen to us? And people said, yes, but Eastern Europe is such an unstable place. We're in North America. That surely can't happen. Oh, God, what's going on? Trump's been elected, and now he's in a massive fight with Ontario, the province of Ontario, which is now threatening to shut off gas supplies and electricity supplies to upstate New York. This was inconceivable, 5 years ago? And now suddenly these trade wars and geopolitical conflicts are proving López Obrador right. Turns out maybe we do need to start producing our own stuff because there's nothing more expensive than oil you simply can't buy.
Now, there are two problems here, right? One, I think, is a little bit of hypocrisy on the Morena government side, because, and this doesn't start with Morena, but they've kept it up. In a move to being more efficient and greener, let's say, not quite green, but less brown, let's say, in energy and electricity production, there is a move towards more and more imports of natural gas to power electricity production in Mexico. Over 75% of those imports come from one place, the US. So for someone that's obsessed with sovereignty, maybe you should move away from continuing to import natural gas from a neighbor who is a little bit mercurial and who has unequivocal military power to do whatever it wants whenever it wants.
And it gets even worse, the hypocrisy that is, because the way the US has so much gas in the Permian Basin in Texas is all that fracking, which is illegal in Mexico. And so you can frack as much as you want in the US and import all that fracking gas into Mexico, but you can't do it here.
The other problem with AMLO's approach is that part of the reason Mexico has become a net importer of oil is not only that it's producing less oil, but also produces low-quality oil. The problem with the oil you get from the Mexican oil fields has nothing to do with how Pemex does things. It's just nature. Oil in Mexico is called heavy oil. What that basically means is that it has your standard hydrocarbon components, plus a bunch of other stuff, most importantly, sulfur. And that makes it inefficient, that makes it polluting. So it requires significant refining to make it pure and good enough. And that means you lose a lot of oil in the process. So no matter how much you're taking out, you're going to be losing a lot of that oil in the refining process.
And that adds another layer to the interest we're dealing with. Because, for example, one of the big things we saw with the administration was the prioritization of using Pemex's low-quality heavy oil, which couldn't be exported, no one would buy it, to power Mexican power plants. Because the CFE, the Federal Electricity Commission, which generates a lot of Mexico's power and has a monopoly over transmission, is owned and run now by the Mexican state. And so Pemex had priority access to selling its heavy oil to these generators, which in turn filled Mexico with just the most noxious gases possible. Particularly the Tula generator, just north of Mexico City, provides 20% of Greater Mexico's electricity, and yet pollution got so bad that recently it's been running at 40% capacity to reduce its oil consumption that it has to buy from Pemex by 80% and avoid Mexicans dying in a black fog of death. Claudia Sheinbaum has now moved to transition that plant to natural gas, which only emits carbon dioxide and water. But guess where that gas is coming from?
The US?
Exactly right. And so all this combination of interests makes governing Mexico through the interests of Pemex very, very difficult. That takes us to the second point. First, it was sovereignty, and then we've got prosperity. This one's interesting because it's a different sort of balance, which is financially, Pemex is in a hole. And yet, remember, Pemex isn't there to make money, it's there to generate prosperity. And if it's not going to be giving money to the government, because at this point, the government is giving money to Pemex, why? Because it's in such deep debt, nobody believes in it, especially not the markets. And so only the Mexican state can ensure that its debts get paid. And yet, there is another thing that you can give people that is produced by Pemex, and that is subsidized petrochemical goods. I'd love to hear what you think about this, Tavo, but one of the things that have really been pushed, especially in this recent administration under the Plan Mexico, which is Mexico's industrial policy, a lot of things that don't seem to be related to oil are underpinned by Pemex. So agriculture is being underpinned by subsidized and sometimes even free synthetic fertilizer being made in a new plant in the state of Veracruz, run and owned by Pemex. Same thing with liquefied gas and the companies that run that, also looking to push energy prices down and keep inflation low. And so you've got this massive smorgasbord of options to subsidize, and yet you don't have much money to do the subsidizing with.
Yeah, I think that's the problem with oil, right? Like we forget just how present it is in everything, right? It's in plastics, it's in fertilizers, it's in a whole range of chemicals, and of course in fuel. Today, when everyone refuses to shut up about AI, AI is everything all the time. AI requires a lot of energy, and the bulk of the energy that we produce in the world still comes from fossil fuels. So, of course, from one angle, it makes a lot of sense to focus on keeping Pemex alive and thriving. But from the other angle, as you say, Pemex is so deeply in debt and so rotten on the inside that one wonders whether this approach actually makes sense.
I think the answer is ultimately yes and no, annoyingly. And why is it yes and no? Because things are going to get even more complex with the arrival of President Claudia Sheinbaum, the successor to López Obrador, his anointed successor, who came to power just a few months ago and was basically served a massive turd on a plate, which was Pemex. Now, Pemex is a weird issue for Claudia Sheinbaum to deal with. She's very much in the tradition of Mexican nationalism that embraces Pemex and that thinks that it is the crown jewel of Mexican nationalism. She did as much when she passed the secondary reforms to the counter-reform that Morena did, because by the time she got to power, Morena and its allies had a supermajority. They could reverse all these constitutional liberalizing reforms from the previous era. And one of the first things she does is she rolls back the energy reform. So the companies under the state's tutelage, so that's CFE, the Electricity Commission, and Pemex, main MO is no longer to make a profit. It is to be a social company. Or is it? This is the thing, the weird counterintuitive effect of the counter reforms. In the same way that Peña Nieto was forced to still have this massive state-owned company under its wing because it's Mexico's third rail, Claudia Sheinbaum can't just completely nationalize all of oil anymore because oil is in such a bad state. The state doesn't have any money, and Pemex has even less. And so, weirdly, even though profit is no longer the main motive for Pemex, what the reforms did was free up the energy ministry to double down on focusing on making Pemex profitable again. Why is that? Because firstly, they didn't expel the private sector. In fact, they're now more desperate for private investment than ever. And with these counter-reforms, both politically and rhetorically, they're prioritizing saving Pemex. Because if you don't save Pemex, it'll go into default, and that will completely ruin Mexico's own credibility, the government of Mexico's credibility, because Pemex debt is now Mexico's debt. The question is, of course, who's going to invest with Pemex as a compulsory partner when it's in such a terrible, terrible state?
And not only that, the thing is, of course, many private players have stuck around. They made big investments, so they don't want to lose those investments. But a lot of big players have left or have divested their positions or have lost commitment, a significant part of their commitment. And these include some of Mexico's biggest tycoons, the kinds of people who have invested in Mexico no matter what. They're pulling back. Why? Because the rhetoric under AMLO And then the fact that Sheinbaum, who was supposed to be sort of a moderating influence, these reforms were actually rolled back. So, of course, a lot of the private sector, even the very nationalist ones, are saying, do I want to be in bed with these guys? I don't know.
I don't know about that, because one of the interesting things to me is, again, one of these weird contradictions, which is you've got to balance the low value of Mexico's energy stock, we'll call it, on the global market, versus the fact that the Mexican government is very clearly nationalist and therefore prioritizes Mexican companies. You can see this in the rise of a billionaire who some of you might know for a different reason, which is Carlos Slim. Carlos Slim is usually known as a telecoms magnate, and yet he probably shouldn't be known as that anymore, because a lot of his telecoms empire is more or less stagnant at this point. And yet, what his companies are investing in right now, at an enormous pace, is in oil. I think his logic is probably the one that some people will come around to eventually, because it's not to contradict what you're saying, Tavo. I think you're absolutely right in that most companies are staying back from investing because they just don't know what's going to happen. They don't trust the government. They're scared. But Carlos Slim, I think, is rich enough to buy when the market is down. He's buying low so that he can sell high later on.
And the key thing here is, I fully agree, his investments in telecom are relatively stagnant, but these are stagnant investments that have $45 billion in revenue a year. So he's got cash to throw around. And the thing about a good old Charlie Slim is that he, no matter what, always believes in Mexico. He always comes back and always invests. And this is classic him. When no one will believe, when everyone's running away, even the very nationalists, he says, all right, guys, let's do it.
And boy, has he done it. You can really see it from the purchases he's made. The most impressive one to me is Talos Energy. It's a Houston-based American oil company that had to insert a poison pill into its structure after it realized that Carlos Slim was buying it up at such a rate that at one point it would stop being a company owned by many people and just a company completely controlled by Carlos Slim. And so the poison pill is, if he reaches a certain threshold, then his shares get diluted to stop him from controlling it. That's how invested this man is in creating an oil empire just in time to save Mexican oil, but also to make an enormous profit. But it's a different sort of investment from what the previous Peña Nieto government wanted. The previous government wanted big, loud exploration into the deep waters to recreate the promise of Mexico's oil exporting past. Pemex at this point is now in intensive care, and so the priority is actually completely different. For example, it's cancelled its deep water explorations and is now investing and asking investors to put their money into increasing production in existing oil fields, especially ones that you wouldn't think are the most profitable ones or the ones that are sort of the most old-fashioned ones, which is the ones on land. They're trying to bring up production from existing and inefficient operations. And Morena has the political capital to do this now. They have a supermajority in Congress. They're enormously powerful politically and influential. The people love them. They've convinced them that their reforms or counter-reforms are, in fact, saving Mexico's crown jewel for the people whilst trying to bring in a bunch of private investment. But crucially, I think the team is what gives away the strategy the most of all. Claudia Sheinbaum, as we all know, is a technocrat. But a lot of the team she's surrounded herself with is also very political. A lot of people are very angry, for example, at the fact that the education minister is basically just a political operator with absolutely no experience in education. Let's remember, a third of Mexico's discretionary budget goes to education. Why? Because the unions are so powerful, and so you need a political operator to influence those unions. You can't forget politics at any point. And that's what makes the energy strategy so interesting and weird. As the energy secretary, you've got Luz Helena González, who is one of the most quiet ministers with the most powerful brief in Mexico at the moment. She never gives interviews, and yet she is enormously empowered and has a massive responsibility, which is to save Pemex. Tellingly, she was Claudia Sheinbaum's finance minister during her time as Mexico City's mayor. And so her brief is of a technical financial person, someone who's going to see how she can work with the finance ministry and with the powers that be to get Pemex out of debt. Meanwhile, The director of Pemex is an academic, another technocrat, which worries a lot of people because as the director of Pemex, you have to deal with the unions, you have to deal with all the politics surrounding Pemex. And this is some academic in a cardigan who has really only met someone to present a paper. And yet, he is probably very well positioned and has the technical expertise to drive up production in an efficient way. He knows the ropes, so to speak. The argument is that Morena and the president are so politically powerful that if ever you did need to muscle in politically, they've got more than enough political capital to keep these technical people on the right path. And so their job is to keep on the straight and narrow, and the government's job is to be its sort of political ballast as they move forward and keep the ship steady. The most recent news from Pemex more or less exemplifies this, which is a really technical move that Pemex did, which was to emit a load of debt. And now, if I knew absolutely nothing about this, I'd say, wait, how does selling debt get you out of debt? And the answer is it's basically what sort of debt you're selling.
This is what we like to call financial wizardry.
Exactly right, or creative accounting, but in a very public and legal sense. So basically what Pemex is doing is that it is moving its responsibilities, all the money it has to pay in the short term, it's now reconfiguring it to be able to pay it later on and at a different interest rate. And so what's interesting to people is that is actually making people more optimistic about Pemex. This one change, which is actually one of the most creative things this government under Claudia Sheinbaum has done, has shocked the other markets who are now starting to snap up contracts from the private sector. And it has made the ratings agencies put Pemex's debt rating up for the first time in who knows how long. And so we're starting to see Pemex, for the first time in decades, start to move in a pretty promising direction. It's nowhere near out of the forest yet. And a lot of people still criticize the fact that a lot of the counter reforms have made it difficult for people to invest. And yet, people are starting to feel slightly more optimistic about this. And why is that important? Because Pemex is so linked to the credibility of the Mexican government. If Pemex isn't sorted, then the Mexican government isn't trustworthy, and therefore investors simply won't invest in any other part of the economy. And so even if you're in textiles or car manufacturing or whatever, really the linchpin to this president's administration is ultimately the failing oil company.
Yeah, I mean, if this works, what I will say is to all of those who are terrified of AMLO, it's a very common thing for the Mexican right wing to say, oh, AMLO and his government, Morena now under Sheinbaum, are just going to turn Mexico into the next Venezuela. If this works, then it will show people that actually we can work with this government. They might not be neoliberal, they might not be, the standard that we would have expected for the past 20 years, but we can do business here. And this is what Carlos Slim has consistently done. He's sort of politically agnostic. He's happy to do business with anyone with whom he can make money. What's tricky for me here is Mexico has become quite good since its many financial crises, the financial side of the economy. As we talked about in our podcast about inflation, Mexico punches way above its weight when it comes to financial experts. And we've seen this in the case of oil. When prices collapsed in 2015, 15 and 16, there was significant hedging done by the Mexican central bank to protect Mexico from a collapse in oil prices, and it worked. And there are many other instances where Mexico has shown that it's become very good at the financial side of the economy. But where it has failed is at the real economy now for many years. And when you talk about this approach that they're taking of focusing on efficiency and making the best of the existing wells, that's great. We need to do that. But the reality is that all of the relevant oil wells that Pemex exploits today are mature wells. They are going to die pretty soon. So we also need to invest in the future. And it's that part that isn't quite clear. So unless they can come up with a plan for the exploration in deep water and unconventionals that is realistic, then this is not really going to go anywhere. And the problem with this is that kind of exploration, that kind of innovation requires huge amounts of investment, but also it takes a very long time. So if they don't come up with a plan today, then that's worrying. in 15 years, not only for this presidency.
That might be the final twist to this whole story, which is Claudia Sheinbaum is, first and foremost, the president, and then, secondly, an environmental scientist. She's very much focused on climate change and mitigating human-made climate change. There is a world, I wouldn't want to put words in her mouth, but the fact that one of the plans that she's got is actually to limit oil production. We're not even at the sort of lower, like at the limit that she's set, but there is actually a limit on how much oil Mexico is allowed to produce at this point. Why? Because she's trying to get Mexico to transition from fossil fuels, first moving to natural gas, which pollutes less, and then to other renewable energies. What's interesting is, if you can get Pemex out of debt and create something beyond oil, then suddenly this whole story might actually end up being a funny tale of how a company that was in deep debt actually left oil early because ultimately it had no other choice. Forget Petróleos Mexicanos. Maybe the future of Pemex is Potencial Energético Mexicano, where we're talking about Mexico's potential energy production far beyond oil, still a national treasure, hopefully out of debt, but no longer digging dead dinosaurs out of the ground.
And that would be an amazing spin, right? Because Mexico is notorious for being a late adopter amongst late adopters. But you can't ignore the fact that we need to move towards renewables. And if you want Mexico to start having real growth again, you need to start innovating. You need to start not only being a place where things are manufactured, but the ideas are made elsewhere and the profit is kept elsewhere. You need to come up with your own ideas, with your own technology, your own companies, and sell those out to the world. Mexico has not been very good at that. Of course, there are examples. We talked last time about Cemex, but there aren't many examples. If the state can back this adequately, it could be a real success story.
So really, let's hope to God Mexico doesn't find any more oil. I'm Alex Gonzalez-Ormerod.
And I am Tavo Figueroa.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we walk you through its economy, its history, its politics, its energy reforms.
And we take you through a stroll across everything that makes it tick. Sign up to the Mexico Political Economist, where you can read a whole bunch of articles that go into the minutiae of many of the things we mentioned throughout this two-part series. And for now,
goodbye.